Now, Anne doesn't get to rebut some of the comments. Our panel here perhaps will tell us that does Commissioner Cavoukian have too rosy a view? Is the sky falling in? Is some of the sky falling in? Is the sky falling in, but we've got the right protections in the right places, or the people that are getting hit are the ones who deserve to be hit? I don't know. Let's jump into it. Without further ado, well, with some further ado, for those of you who are tweeting, the hashtag is FPF-PII. We will have, this is not being live streamed, but it's being recorded, so you've all just been opted in to that. We'll have the full video available as well as any of the slides that you hear today. A quick thank you to Kim Gray and IMS Health and Lance Hoffman and the CSPRI. Lance will tell you a little bit more about GW's new institute that's been up for a bit, but some of you may not know about. And I will so thank the two of them for helping make this happen. We are live blogging it, so we will attribute the folks here. We won't attribute the folks in the audience unless you say, hi, my name is so-and-so. Maybe that'll be a good way to do it. But there'll be at least a semi-transcript real time. And without further ado, let me turn over to Kim Gray, the Chief Privacy Officer of IMS Health, to introduce the next panel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure that's on. Oh, yeah, okay. On the far end, we have Dr. Alessandro Acquisti, who's an Associate Professor of Information Systems and Public Policy at the Heinz College, Carnegie Mellon University. He's co-director of CMU's Center for Behavioral Decision Research and a member of the National Academies Committee on Public Response to Alerts and Warnings using Social Media and Associated Privacy Considerations. Alessandro has held visiting positions at the Universities of Rome, Paris, Freiburg, and Harvard, and at Microsoft Research in New England, and we welcome Dr. Acquisti. To his right, we have Dr. Khaled El-Imam, whom Anne's kind of already given an introduction to in her speech. Dr. Khaled El-Imam is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Medicine, senior investigator at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario Research Institute, and a Canada Research Chair in Electronic Health Information at the University of Ottawa. And to my left, most of you know Dr. LaTanya Sweeney, who is the director and founder of the Data Privacy Lab at Harvard University. The lab works with real-world stakeholders to solve today's privacy technology problems. Dr. Sweeney, a visiting professor and scholar at Harvard, previously a distinguished career professor of computer science, technology and policy at Carnegie Mellon University, was recently appointed to the Privacy and Security seat of the Federal HIT Policy Committee, the group responsible for advising ONC on policy for the new National Health Information Infrastructure. So I'm here as moderator, which I believe is somewhat of a joke, because if we thought that Dr. Anne Cavoukian was animated and passionate about what she feels, I have three people to my left who are likewise. And I'm going to turn over to Dr. Sweeney first, because I think we're talking about what the risks of re-identification of de-identified data are, what the pluses, the minuses, just what those risks are, and I think she, of all on the panel, can speak to what the risks are. That's her primary focus. I'm going to then turn to Dr. El-Imam, who's going to talk about some of his works. And by the way, Dr. Cavoukian mentioned a recently published paper. You all have a copy of this. It's on the tables. That was the document that she referenced that Dr. El-Imam has just published. And lastly, we're going to talk to Dr. Acquisti, have Dr. Acquisti talk, because a lot of what he does is very interesting work around behavior and social media kinds of things. And I think in my pea-brained way of thinking compared to the three on this panel, much of the research that's done by Dr. Acquisti is more, what do we need to worry about in the future? It's not just what we're worried about today, but it's the progress of publicly available data and what do we need to do. So with that, we're already a little bit behind. We're getting a little bit of a late start, so we had kind of earmarked 15 minutes apiece with some questions. We'll see how that goes. LaTanya.
It's already been stimulating, and I thank you for having me. So I think everyone on this panel will agree that there are re-identification risk and remedies. And what we may not agree on today, especially Khaled and I, is the nature and extent of re-identification risk in the United States. Khaled, who has a Canadian perspective, wants more proof. His paper is an example of that. So today I'm going to provide him with some evidence based on my own demonstrated re-identifications in the United States. So let me start by addressing why Khaled and others can even question evidence of re-identifications. Some of it has to do with the structure of policy that hides the actual risk and harms that do happen, and some has to do with my own experience. So my work on assessing re-identification risk began in 1997. At that time, de-identified medical data referred to data that had no explicit identifiers, so no name, address, social security number. The demographics that remained usually included date of birth, gender, and a 5-digit zip code. And as was discussed by Peter Swire, I demonstrated how these demographics could be linked to a population register, such as a voter list shown here, to re-identify people by name and gain sufficient information to contact the subject of the data. The problem, of course, is not the voter list, because there are many other population registers. In surveying the 1990 census data, I found that 87% of the U.S. population was unique based on those characteristics. A heavily populated zip code was not necessarily sufficient. That was a belief held by the federal statistics offices at that time, that if you had a large enough zip code, you could release it. But in zip code 60623 in Chicago, there are over 100,000 people, but there are very few over the age of 55. Another interesting data point is zip code 11794 in the state of New York. There are only 5,000 people that live there. They're all between the ages of 19 and 24, and that's because they're the dorms of the State University of New York. So even though there are very few people who live there, even if you give me date of birth, gender, and zip code, I can't tell you who they are. So, and then what you see here is what happens as we generalize and sort of where the HIPAA safe harbor comes in. In 1998, a year later, I was asked to conduct a re-identification experiment related to a legal case, Southern Illinoisan versus Illinois Department of Public Health. The newspaper, Southern Illinoisan, requested month and year of diagnosis and a 5-digit zip code for children in Southern Illinois who appeared on the state's cancer registry having neuroblastoma. There was no birth date, no age, no gender. Children don't vote, get married, own real estate, have credit cards, so their information doesn't tend to appear in other available data. And for those of you who are familiar with medical data, there is no ICD-9 diagnosis code for neuroblastoma. So you cannot just do a simple search against medical information. 22 children matched this request, and after some effort, I provided a list of 20 names to the department, which confirmed that each name was correct. The judge in the case sealed the method used and my testimony, thereby depriving us of public discourse of the fact. This slide that you see here was among the information I presented. Each path through this diagram from top to bottom is a way to re-identify children in that data. Those highlighted with red show the steps that I actually took to re-identify the 20 cases. From that time forward, I did a long laundry list of re-identification experiments commissioned by federal, state, and city agencies, by insurance, pharmaceutical, and other large companies, and by researchers. These experiments revealed threats, including in pharmacy data, survey data, medical histories, and so forth, to name a few. But unfortunately, the work was done under confidentiality agreements, because I couldn't find any research funding at that time to do this kind of work. And so as a result, the findings did not find themselves in the public domain. So now, 12 years later, confusion about re-identification risk have emerged. That's certainly understandable. So we are revisiting these experiments and conducting new ones to inform the public. I actually have to thank Khaled and Jane Yakowitz especially, because her written mischaracterizations of the Illinois case helped convince those involved in the case to decide last week that I can speak publicly about the method, which is why I can share these slides with you today, and now I can also publish on the methods. We also just concluded last week the first of our new experiments. In 2004, my colleagues at Harvard received a National Science Foundation grant to collect information about Harvard undergraduates for 4 years. They reported various roommate decisions, majors, demographics, and Facebook information about their taste in books, movies, and sexual preference. Part of NSF's funding requirement was to make a version of the collected data widely available. So the researchers attempted to de-identify the data. We took a small sample of the data, only gender, race, and some dorm information. And the dorm information was de-identified, so they just had a made-up identifier and a neighborhood identifier and some rooming information. So we provided a social network of roommates. There were 1,640 students. We re-identified more than 1,400 of them accurately using only publicly available information. There are no dates, no zip codes, and their population, like the Sunni population, has demographics that are extremely homogeneous. There are numerous possible ways to re-identify these data. The ways listed on the slide provide the results that are reported. We also surveyed students who had no training in statistics, mathematics, or computer science, and then we asked them to describe how they would re-identify the data. We also gave 2 other non-computer science, non-mathematical, non-statistical students 2 weeks to re-identify students on their own in any way they could, and they found a couple of hundred. These different strategies use different other publicly available sources and approaches. The take-home is not to fall into these false beliefs that re-identification is readily available, as Commissioner Kevorkian recommended, that we all take note of. It's also not to believe that there are no risks to re-identifications. A little bit alarmed by that, by Peter Swire's comments, because it's not the case that either of these examples are correct. The pendulum swinging to one end or the other does not serve society. It's more importantly to understand the actual risk and the actual space of remedies. The experiments that I just reported have showed readily available risk using different registers, voter lists, birth notices, death data, telephone books. These provide ways to re-identify data, even data that did not have date of birth, gender, or zip information. Society has its own reasons for having these registers, and so the goal has to be to find strategies that we can share data widely, but to do so in a way that doesn't lead to obvious re-identifications. As a computer scientist, the other part of my work has been on finding such solutions. I'm not going to talk to you about them today because we don't have time. That's not the focus of this panel. But we've done a tremendous amount of work, this is sort of highlighted in blue there, that says that society doesn't have to believe in this false belief that you have to choose between privacy or utility. And there we've got many examples in many kinds of data, from surveillance to face de-identification and so forth, to show that society can enjoy both privacy and utility. I just wanted to conclude my few minutes with two slides motivated by the comments of Peter Swire and Commissioner Kevorkian. This is a survey that we recently conducted. It's a before and after data sharing picture of HIPAA. This came out in one of the National Academy Press reports right before HIPAA privacy rule was promulgated, and it showed all the places a typical but hypothetical patient's record would go in the United States. This is an updated of that now. The data sharing, patients have no control, the data sharing is hidden, there's no basis for correcting the values, there's no attention to fair information practices. The data may be explicitly identified or re-identified because one of the heaviest motivations for data sharing today is money. PricewaterhouseCoopers said that health data, the secondary use of health data, is now a $1 billion market. So the discussion is no longer in the space of where Peter Swire had it, in the sense of federal statistics offices being good citizens. The question is not even limited to data that comes from the federal government. The data comes from all kinds of places, and it's heavily motivated by finances. And solutions, as Commissioner Kevorkian recommended, are certainly available. They're absolutely available. But they're not available through the past regulations and approaches that we used before. We have to find a way to ride the technology bandwagon. We've got to change technology in a way that we can, in fact, say, what's the newest, best way to do this, and that get incorporated in. And just as she mentioned, Khaled has a way to certify data, we too have one, the private cert approach. So let me stop there, and I'll turn it over to the next one.
What I wanted to talk about today was the article that you have in front of you, which is a review of the evidence on re-identification attacks on health and non-health data. I'll just give you a very brief overview of what we found from this. The main driver for that work was the articles that Commissioner Kavoukian had mentioned, for example, by Paul Ohm and others, regarding the ease of re-identification. So we were concerned about some of the evidence that was presented in that work, and we wanted to do a more systematic review of that evidence to really understand what the risks were. When you do a systematic review, I mean, this is the generally accepted method for summarizing evidence. So, publishing an article or giving an example is nice and it's interesting and it's useful, but you really don't draw conclusions until you do a systematic review and a meta-analysis, because that takes into account inconsistencies across the evidence and so on. So it's a standard way for, in many of the sciences, to summarize evidence. With a systematic review, you can only summarize material that has been published. So if information is not published, then you can't really say anything about it. But as part of the analysis, we do a sensitivity to see how our conclusions would change if there were many unpublished studies showing, result A versus result B. So publication bias is taken into account when you do a systematic review. But at the end of the day, it's only based on what is published, and if something is not out there, it's not out there. What can we say, right? So we wanted to characterize the known re-identification attacks on health data and contrast that to attacks on other kinds of data. We wanted to compute the overall proportion of records that can be successfully re-identified in such attacks, and assess whether these re-identification attacks demonstrate a fundamental weakness with the identification methods that have been applied in the past. So up to October 2010, we found 14 published re-identification attacks. These cover health and non-health data. And we searched through 3 big databases, which cover most of the computer science, medical informatics, and statistics, statistical disclosure control literature. And there were only 14 published attacks successful attacks on real data. Only 10 of those describe the methodology that was used. So in 4 cases, people just said, we did it. For example, the AOL example with the New York Times reporters, they just said, we did it. There was a case, a federal court case in Canada, where one of the parties made claims that the other party re-identified a database without presenting the methodology. So there are a number of examples where people just make claims. But in 10 cases, the actual methodology was described. 6 out of the 14 attacks were on health data. So less than half of the attacks were on health data, and 11 out of the 14 attacks were conducted by researchers. So researchers tend to do the most re-identification attacks, at least the ones that are published. And these are partially because they were demonstration attacks. These were studies to demonstrate that this can be done. And the vast majority of the attacks were done in the US by US researchers and on US data. And only 2 of the 14 attacks actually re-identified the identified data. So this is really a very important point. Peter Swire mentioned the Netflix example in his presentation. So in Netflix, the authors of the Netflix attack actually say the data was not de-identified. So they took a data set, the Netflix data set that was not de-identified, and they re-identified claimed to have re-identified some people. It's not really a demonstration of anything. If you don't de-identify the data, well, you can't, it's not a surprise it's going to be re-identified. The AOL example, which was when AOL released search queries, and then the New York Times reporters re-identified an individual. Well, we know a lot of people run vanity queries where they do a search on their name. Actually, a large percentage of people run vanity queries where they enter their names. Also, there's evidence that it's quite possible to determine the location of individuals based on their search queries. So if you give somebody a set of search queries, it's not that difficult to re-identify them, because it's very likely people would have typed their name in the search queries. And then the example of the neuroblastoma registry, as Latanya mentioned, a 5-digit zip code was included, and neuroblastoma is a childhood cancer, so the age range is quite narrow. So in that case, with a 5-digit zip code, this wouldn't even pass the safe harbor standard for de-identification. So the key point is, if you don't de-identify the data, and then you come afterwards and say, I've re-identified, it doesn't actually say much about de-identification methods. So only 2 of them were attacks on de-identified data. One of them was an ONC study, which found that only 0.013% of the records could be re-identified. That's 2 records out of 15,000 were re-identified when you anonymize or identify the data properly. The other study was done in the UK, and although the reporting was quite, left a lot to be desired, it seemed that the success rate was also quite low. And this was a re-identification of a data set from the Office of National Statistics. And then the last point is that all the re-identification attacks were identity disclosure. So all 14 were identity disclosure attacks. It means that there are different kinds of disclosure attacks. It's identity disclosure, attribute disclosure. Attribute disclosure is when you discover something new about people without actually re-identifying which record belongs to them. So there are no examples of that happening. The only type of attacks that have been published are identity disclosure attacks. The other, I think, useful point is that even when the data was not de-identified, the average success rate was 26%. This is across health and non-health data. So even when you don't de-identify data properly, the success rate is not 90% or 80%, it's 26%. So I think one can argue that if you de-identify the data and your starting point is 26%, you can bring that down quite a bit very fast. So what did we learn from all of this? The evidence for re-identification attacks is quite weak. You can't really draw very strong conclusions from this, and I think it would be inappropriate to draw strong conclusions, either way, that re-identification provides a perfect answer or that the identification methods don't work. So that the identification methods provide a perfect answer or that the identification doesn't work. Just the evidence is not very strong. There's a lot of heterogeneity. The confidence intervals were very large. A lot of the reporting was not that great. And then I think the other key point to keep in mind is that when we did a sensitivity analysis on unpublished studies, you'd need a good number of unpublished studies to change the conclusion, either way. So, having 1 more study or 2 more studies, they will not change the conclusion dramatically. You really need 30, 40, 50 studies, depending on what the studies show, to change that conclusion in any appreciable way. So I wouldn't say it's very stable, but it'll take quite a bit of work, I think. Coming up with 1 or 2 more examples, it'll hard to change that conclusion. So to close, I'll just make a couple of points about why re-identification is hard. We do a lot of work in the U.S. I mean, I know we're based in Canada, but a lot of the organizations we work with are in the U.S. So I have a lot of experience here. And I think that many of the risk assessments that are done on a re-identification risk assessment are idealistic, in the sense that they assume that a re-identification attempt will be made. For example, they assume the probability of that happening is 1. Well, it's not. You can make the argument very easily that when you account for probability of a re-identification attempt occurring and try to model that, it reduces your overall risk quite a bit. A lot of these assessments make the assumption that the data will be breached, that an outsider or the data set will be lost. Well, the probability of that is not 1. I mean, it's not certain that if you have a data set that will get lost, within the next 12 months. You can model that, right? And there's evidence to allow you to assign numbers to this and model the probability of a breach actually occurring and take that into account in your risk assessment. So a lot of the events that are just assumed are going to happen can be modeled. And once you start modeling them and putting numbers to them, the probabilities start going down quite a lot. Where the overall probability of a breach occurring and of someone finding the data and of knowing a neighbor or having an ex-spouse who has gone to that hospital and so on, when you start modeling all of these things, the probabilities are quite small for anything happening to start off with. And then if something does happen, if you apply good data identification methods, that will reduce the probability down even further. So I think it's important to remember that when you model all the whole probability of these successive events, your risks can go down. And I think it's appropriate to model these things because it's not certain that there will be breach. It's not certain that someone will attempt a re-identification. It's not certain that someone who works at the company will have an ex who has admitted the hospital during that month and so on. The other things that I see, of course, is that a lot of people make very broad inferences. For example, one that I've seen now made a couple of times is the assumption that, and this is in a healthcare context, that patients go to the same facilities, patients live in the same facilities, in the same zip codes as the facilities they seek care at. So if I go to a hospital, then since we don't know where the patient lives, we assume that, and we have the hospital location, we assume that the patient lives in the same location as the hospital. Well, that may be true, but if you look at data, you'll see that a lot of cases, the zip code is just the hospital. There are no residents in that area, for example. So you cannot make that assumption right away. And you can model that as well. You can do risk assessments and see, well, what if it's true? What impact would that have? What if the patient lived in a zip 3 that's similar to the facility? What would happen there? At least from our experiences, it's not obvious that this is always the case. The other assumption that I've seen made is people assume that if you have diagnosis, that the age and gender follow through from that. Again, we've modeled this. It's not true. I mean, for some diseases, gender, of course, can be predicted, but for a lot, you can't. There's a very broad distribution of age and a broad distribution on gender, and it's not obvious that if you have diagnosis X that you'll be likely to be male or female or have a particular age, or from drugs for that matter. A lot of also these re-identification attacks or simulated re-identification attacks ignore sampling, the effect of sampling. Sampling is very important, and you have to count that on your risk assessment. And of course, the other thing with re-identification attacks is that a lot of times in the real world, data quality is poor. And you can model that as well. So when you take into account all of these factors, the risks are in reality, I mean, not when you pay someone to actually go and re-identify your data, but in reality, the probabilities tend to be quite small. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I just want to interrupt for a minute before I put Alessandra up, and we're going to segue into a different topic, because most of what Latanya and Colette have been talking about has been healthcare. And I know this audience is not all healthcare. In fact, I think it's a small minority here. But one thing, Colette, that you had mentioned a couple times was that in many of these re-identification attacks that may or may not have been successful, the data wasn't actually de-identified. And I just was looking for a little clarification, because of course, for those of us in the healthcare sphere, we work under HIPAA's rules, and it's very clear what is de-identified. It's a term of art under HIPAA, and there are some very specific things that one must do to render data to be de-identified, whereas in many of our other sectors, we're looking for anonymization, and it's a fuzzier line. And so to both Colette and to Latanya, my question is the HIPAA de-identification model of anonymizing something that other sectors could potentially benefit from? Do you feel like the parameters put forth by HIPAA, which are very specific, to render something de-identified are useful parameters, and is that something that maybe we should be looking at in a more grand scale? And Latanya and Colette, whichever of you would like to speak to that.
You want to go first?
You can go ahead for 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll answer your question. I've interpreted it in two different ways, so I'll answer both ways. The first one is with respect to the systematic review and how we identified proper de-identification there. So in that case, we used the two standards in HIPAA. So we assumed that if a data set would meet the safe harbor, then it's de-identified, or if there's evidence that an expert de-identified the data and documented and documented and ensured that the risk was very low, then we considered that to be properly de-identified. So some very basic definitions of what's properly de-identified in that systematic review. I think in general, the two identification, my view anyway, is that the two identification standards in HIPAA, safe harbor is, I think, appropriate under certain conditions, and it'd be very useful to spell out these conditions when it works really well, and the conditions where it might not work well, and in the situations where it might not work well, then it's probably prudent to switch to the second standard, which is the expert certification standard. The problem with the expert certification standard is very widely defined, so it'll, I think, benefit significantly from more precise definitions of what's acceptable risk, what's the qualification of an expert, and so on. And I think if you do those two things, you have two very good standards for the identification, which could probably help other areas as well, quite a bit.
In addressing the HIPAA standard, first of all, I have to tell you that the things that I reported were sort of released after he wrote his paper. So the fact that the neuroblastoma example, both in his speaking as well as in the paper, are not correct, are not actually correct. So one of the questions that came up by the attorneys, so a little bit downstream while the case was going through the appeal process, was the privacy rule then came out after the work had been done, and the question was if public health released the data to the newspaper under the HIPAA safe harbor. That meant the 5-digit zip codes would remain. The month and year of diagnosis would just simply move to year of diagnosis, and we were able to confirm that in fact it would not have changed the results at all. And this was kind of alarming because in almost every re-identification experiment of the 30 or so re-identification experiments that I was involved in, they're all high-profile data sets. They're all publicly released data sets. They're the kind of data sets that, given out in public, people have incentives to re-identify them, either for their own personal gain or to connect it to data that they hold outside of that. So in terms of who would be at risk on the neuroblastoma, even the safe harbor does pose challenges. And the ONC study, which just really was based only on demographics of year of birth, zip code, and gender, are also not sufficient, and race, are also not sufficient because we had studies, and we are now repeating all of these studies without confidentiality agreements, based simply on medical history as a unique identifier when you have hospital discharge data over years, which is publicly and semi-publicly available. And so these really push us on even the safe harbor standard. And just make two real quick points with respect to that, and moving to the statistician. Khaled says, yeah, but I want a lot of studies before I'll be willing to consider changing something like the safe harbor. But actually there's a political component to privacy. And the political component is the one person. So in the 1997 study, I got that right away. It just so happened that William Weld, who was the governor of Massachusetts, data was in that data set and was among the people re-identified. And I actually believe that the real reason HIPAA came out with a change away from date of birth, gender, and zip code was because he was in the data set of the original study. And in the data set of the neuroblastoma cases in Illinois, Brendan Steele was one of the children, and he was highly publicized in that newspaper. And there was strong reason to believe, and it created a tremendous stir, this case did, in Southern Illinois. And these Harvard students all of them have now graduated. They're in politics, they're in business, and to have things that had happened and decisions they had made be memorialized in a data set and widely shared could be quite devastating. The statistician provision, they all challenge sort of the foundations of the safe harbor. The statistician provision, what I believe the best way forward is not to prescribe by law, but to prescribe by method. Sort of like the way we do encryption. The way we do encryption in the federal government, standards and stuff, is we basically have another body who says, this is the current state of the art. And then academics and others beat up on that one, show it's a vulnerability, introduce a new one, and then we raise the bar. And then they beat up on that one, and then they show a new one, and then we raise the bar. And that's exactly how this needs to go. There needs to be a group, an HHS, wherever, somewhere, who can ride the bandwave of technical knowledge and not try to stand a stone wall that says either our existing policy is good enough or our existing policy is not. That's not the best way forward. The best way forward is to let the data flow with guarantees.
So I just wanted to make one comment in response.
Make it quick.
Very quick. although the information that Latanya mentioned was not available when we wrote this article, we did talk to the Illinois Department of Public Health, and we did get information from them about the court case. So I'm confident with what we wrote here in the sense that we got it from the horse's mouth, basically.
Well,
Okay, moving right along. Thank you both for answering my question. Alessandro? We're switching gears a bit now, getting away from healthcare.
Well, thank you. I'd like to start thanking actually Jules and Chris for organizing such a timely event. I will try to summarize the results of a series of experiments we published this summer on a special form of re-identification, the ability to re-identify people and in fact infer sensitive information about them, starting just from faces. And as motivating facts, I will present you two statistics, two actually pieces of data. Back in 2000, it was estimated in a paper which came out in Science a couple of years ago, 100 billion photos were shot worldwide. Only a very, very tiny proportion of them were uploaded to the internet. Unless you were a celebrity in 2000, your photo probably was not up there. In 2010, 10 years later, 2.5 billion photos were uploaded by only just Facebook users in a single month, most of them identified. In about the same span of time, 1997 to 2010, there was also a dramatic increase in the accuracy of computer face recognizers, in their ability of detecting and identifying people in images. More or less every 4 or 5 years, you have an increase in about the order of magnitude in the ability of computers to recognize faces. So face recognition is not yet perfect, but it's getting better and better. So this summer, we presented these results of a study where we combined these different technologies. Two of them I already mentioned. More and more data available about us online. In fact, more and more facial information about us online. Better and better computer recognition. Cloud computing, which allows to do millions of face comparisons in a few seconds, even if you don't have a supercomputer available to you there, but you can access it through professional services online. Ubiquitous computing, which allows, for instance, your smartphone to access a cloud computing cluster and therefore exploit great computational power to do millions of face comparisons in a few seconds, therefore try to do re-identification of people in real time. And finally, statistical re-identification, the ability of combining databases to indeed re-identify people and also infer more sensitive information. In a nutshell, this what we were trying to do was to see whether when you combine all these technologies into one big mixer, you end up with the ability of re-identify people in real time, on a massive scale, just starting from their faces, and in fact infer sensitive information about them. You can imagine this as a problem where you start with some images of faces which do not have a name. They could be the faces of people in the street. There could be images of people on a dating site where users do upload photos, but they don't use their real names. They use pseudonyms. You have instead another database which is identified. Online, you can find LinkedIn, Facebook profile, organizational rosters. For most of us in this room, I will bet there exists at least one photo online with your name. And using face recognition, you try to find a match between the two databases. And once you have that, it means that now you can give a name from the identified database and move it into the unidentified database. Now you can name the people on Match.com or the person in the street. But not only that, because if you have a name, then you can also learn more about that person online. From a name and a little bit more information, you can find out maybe the date of birth, where the person lives, maybe their set of friends from LinkedIn or from Facebook. And from these, you can infer even more sensitive information, such as maybe credit score, or social security number, political or sexual orientation. And you can bring it back to the anonymous phase. So this is the story we're trying to tell. And what we did was to test in 3 experiments whether this can be done now. In the first experiment, we did online-to-online identification. We started from images from a very popular dating site in the US. We compared them to images on Facebook, and we ended up finding the links between people's Facebook profiles and people on the dating site, simply through their face. Using this approach, we were able to re-identify 1 out of 10 subjects in the dating site database, which was not nationwide database. We were focusing on a specific region, a northeastern city. The second experiment was a offline-to-online identification. We started from faces, images of faces taken on CMU campus. So we asked students to stop for an experiment. We took a webcam shot of them, and we uploaded the image online, where we started, as they were filling out a survey, we started comparing them using cloud computing cluster to images we had downloaded from Facebook profiles. As the students were filling out the survey, we would find the best 10 best matches, and we would populate the survey they were filling out, the last page of the survey, with the 10 best matches found by the recognizer. So that the user, the subject, then had to, on the last page of the survey, click and indicate, yes, I see myself in this photo, or no, I do not see myself in this photo. We were able to find the ground truth, so to say. And using this approach is an example of a good match that the recognizer did find, and probably you can also too, although the image is quite small. We were able to identify 1 out of 3 subjects in the experiment. And then we decided we can push the envelope further, because so far what we have done in big picture terms was to start from a face, which is anonymous, find using face recognition, PIT-PAT, a face recognizer developed at CMU, find a identify image, and specifically we are using Facebook profiles. But 2 years ago, in 2009, we showed that we could start from Facebook profiles, we could use publicly available data from the def master file, and end up predicting statistically the social security number of the person owner of the Facebook profile. So if you now combine the 2 studies together, you just do 1 + 1, you see where I'm going. The idea of starting from a face, and through face recognition, by finding the Facebook profile for that person, you can end up predicting the social security number of that person just from their face. And we did this experiment, and in this case, we were able to find correctly the first 5 digits with 4 attempts for 27% of our sample. But the story is bigger than that. Using terms that Paul Holm and others have been endorsing, is a story of data accretion. This is in a way similar, this slide I'm about to present is similar to the in a nutshell slide, but shows the same story from a different angle. The idea is that we can start from an anonymous face, then we find an identified face which matches that, which can come from different sources. Based on this, we now have a presumptive, so probabilistically correct name. Based on the name, we can find publicly available data under that name. Based on the publicly available data, we can predict not publicly available data, but more sensitive, and finally we get that back to the face. And in fact, we try to do this in real time. So we develop an iPhone app, which indeed takes a photo of a person, uploads a photo to our computing cluster, matches it against our database. If it does find a good match, it assumes that the name coming from the Facebook profile is correct, looks for information under the name, particularly looks for demographics, and then uses the demographics combined to the algorithm we developed in 2009 to predict the social security number, and then sends back the social security number back to the phone, showing it on the screen overlaid on the face of the person in application of augmented reality. So this app works. Nevertheless, I call it a demo because it's not yet scalable. We cannot go around the United States and try to identify anyone against a database of 300 million people. Our database is small, hundreds of thousands of images coming from a certain city. So currently, we are protected from this kind of future. If you believe that this future is creepy, I do. We are protected from this by computational cost. It's very difficult to do on 300 million people scale what we did on hundreds of thousands of images. We are protected from how do we get that volume of images. We are not Google, we are not Bing, we are not Facebook. We are protected by false positives. When you start working on the order of hundreds of thousands and millions of people and try to match their faces, you realize that we are not unique and beautiful snowflakes. Many people look similar to us. And computer face recognizers do face this challenge in avoiding false positives. But you know what? I'm not sure how long this kind of protection will really protect us, because computational power keeps increasing over time. Data available, publicly available, including facial images, will keep increasing over time. Algorithms for predicting, for matching faces keep getting better and better. And just to give you a sense of how fast things are moving in this area, when we presented these results this summer in August, we wanted to add a slide saying, well, what we did on a phone today could be done with glasses tomorrow. In fact, there is Brazilian police supposedly is already thinking about using something for the Olympic Games, or yes, I guess. And maybe one day contact lenses. And Ralph, one of my two co-authors, said, no, don't put the contact lenses. No one will believe it. It makes things look so silly. That was August. And this was a few weeks ago. Researchers, a combined group of European and Japanese researchers, have developed contact lenses with a Wi-Fi antenna and a LED. They have not tested them on humans. That's a rabbit eye. That's not a human eye. But if proof of concept exists of contact lenses which display information directly to your eye and are connected through a Wi-Fi to an external computer. So my point being, what we did now is not yet scalable. I don't know how long it will take. Not that long, perhaps. And so what I'm closing with, indeed, Kim was mentioning, most of my work is behavior rather than data mining. So I'm interested in the behavior implications of these technologies. So I list some implications here. The face is really the conduit between your online and your offline persona, and it's very difficult to de-identify. There are blurring techniques, but your face remains the same. Unless you want to go around always covering your face, you can't be recognized. The emergence of PPI, personally predictable information, inferences that people will make about you simply by looking at you through contact lenses connected to these cloud computing clusters and face recognition. The rise of visual facial searchers. Imagine Google and Bing offering in the future similar services for facial images that now are done for textual searches. The democratization of surveillance. What we did was based on publicly available data, publicly available technology, cheap technology. So what we did is something that anyone else can do on their devices. Social networks, profiles becoming de facto real IDs, because most users of Facebook, for instance, do use their real first and last names. Not all of them, but most. And finally, the bigger question, what will privacy mean and anonymity mean in this kind of future? We are not there yet now, but I feel we are getting there quite quickly, where face recognition can lead to this real-time identification and inference of sensitive data just looking at faces. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm looking at my watch and seeing that we have all of 2 minutes for some quick questions, so I think that might mean one. I have secured a yes from both Khaled and from Latanya that they are going to be here the better part of the day, so if you do have specific questions and want to catch up with them, they will be around. I'm wondering, though, since Alessandro's talk is a little bit different, if there is perhaps one question for Alessandro. Alan.
What about facial recognition and lying? And maybe you could even tell whether I'm lying now. There is some scientific initiative designed to capture facial recognition information and using that determine whether someone is or is not telling the truth. Am I telling the truth?
I left my iPhone on the desk, so I cannot. I'm joking, but my joke. I explain my joke in a second. So yes, there is lots of research on predicting or identifying emotions based on face recognition, as well as lying. So As always, these technologies are not that accurate yet, but I don't know how long we will be protected by their current inaccuracy. So simply saying that, well, they don't work that well today, doesn't mean that 10 years from now they will not work much better. The joke I was making about the iPhone was that I was implying in my joke that my iPhone can do it better than me. That's probably not the case, right? However, one of the behavior implications we consider in our study is the more we will start using these technologies. Imagine this future where I have contact lenses and I look at you, I can see your name, and I have immediately predictions about your political orientation and your credit score. Human beings have evolved through hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, developing the ability of, by gut feelings, inferring information about the other person. How much I can trust you, how much do I like you. And now we have, in a way, a computer-mediated communication which happens not online, but in face-to-face interaction. So I could have information coming from an algorithm which maybe reiterate or maybe contrast what my gut feeling are telling me. So to me, the challenge, the interesting question behaviorally, but also potentially the creepy challenge, is whether these new technologies will create a different way in which we interact with each other. Because no longer I will trust my instinct about you and my evolutionary, my DNA. I will trust what the algorithm is telling me in real time about you. And this algorithm may be 95% of the times correct, imagine in a distant future, but there will always be some element of noise, some element of error. And I fear about when the error will be so small that we will ignore it and we will always assume that the algorithm is right. And we'll make face-to-face decisions based no longer on our humanity, but on the algorithm which is providing information to us in real time.
Interesting implications for online dating.
and offline dating too.
Okay, I've gotten the blessing for 5 more minutes since we were cut short in the beginning. So if there are any other questions, wow, okay. Gee, I don't know who went first. Alessandro, you want to pick? I'll put that onus on you.
Please speak loudly.
This gentleman right here, I believe you were first.
Quick question, I think. The use of Facebook, the use of these technologies against Facebook as your main source of facial recognition is clearly in violation of the terms of use, in my view, of the terms of use of Facebook, probably half a dozen provisions. I'm wondering more, though, this was a study, obviously, it wasn't for commercial, but still, I'm wondering, what do you think about the fact that it is a violation in terms of use? Do you think it's relevant at all? And how do you feel the effectiveness of that or the non-effectiveness of it works into your thesis?
Right, so that's an excellent question. In reality, in the first experiment, we didn't even get to Facebook at all. I didn't have the time to discuss the details, but what we used was simply cache information by a very popular search engine. What happens is that Facebook profiles have primary profile photos, which are by default searchable by search engines. You can make yourself unsearchable, but that's not the default setting. And most people leave the default setting. We know this from status quo bias. So leave their primary profile photos searchable on search engines. Also, most profiles are identified. So we didn't even get into the Facebook. We simply use the API of the search engine. Other than that, you can imagine multiple different scenarios here. If you look at the future, commercial exploitations or non-commercial exploitation. One scenario is the hacker scenario, someone who does it by completely violating the terms of services and tries to create a database which is not used for commercial purposes because it would be probably shut down, but is still used for some secret surveillance. The other most likely scenario is that the entities which currently have large databases of identified images will use them. Currently, they're already using them, but with significant self-restraint. For instance, on Facebook, face recognition is used mainly for tagging. We cannot know, and the history of self-regulation, especially in online social networks and on Facebook, doesn't suggest optimism. We cannot know whether 5 to 10 years from now, the same data will not be used also for other services. Facebook becoming an identity verification service for offline interaction, or perhaps other companies selling identified facial data to others.
I think Colette actually had a question. We have just two more that we're going to take. Colette, and then
And
there's...
then Bob Gelman after that.
Okay, just a quick question, Alessandro. I mean, wouldn't this spur an arms race, so to speak, of people developing technologies to counteract the potential risk that you described? I mean, the scenario that you gave of a future where your picture can be taken and everything about it will be known, wouldn't an industry emerge over time to counteract that by feeding false information or creating false profiles in order to thwart this?
The arms race is a very possible scenario. It doesn't relate just to facial re-identification. Broadly speaking, in the area of online identity, there are companies which try to remove bad or false information about you, and there are companies who try to find any information about you. Who is going to win, I don't know. But in the case of facial identification, the challenge is that somewhere your real face with your real name will be online, most likely. And you cannot go around, unless we go around all the time masking our face, and unless we are so lucky to be born being called John Smith, and when someone tries to find us on a zabasearch.com database, there are hundreds of thousands of other John Smith, then I don't know how long this protection again will protect us.
Thanks. Bob Gelman?
I'd like to ask a question about the second prong of the HIPAA de-identification technique for experts. One of the problems is that there's no one knows what's going on. No one knows what an expert is. No one knows what methodology is being applied. And I wonder if you think that the approach would be better if there were a requirement that before an expert opinion was relied upon, it had to be published and basically allow it to be crowdsourced for its whether it was adequate or not, and there would be a time period and a methodology for publishing it, and it couldn't be relied upon for 30 days or 60 days or something like that, and you could all have your students go do this as a homework assignment.
I'll respond first. I'll respond. I think way too much of medical data and the data sharing is hidden, including verification of why data was released under the statistical provision of HIPAA. Some person with any, as you said, with any who self-proclaims that they have the qualifications can assert that the data can be released regardless of the fields, and they never have to publish why they say that. There's no report, there's no oversight, there's no standard. And what would be really great instead is, one, yes, to require that whatever the standard used is in fact published. This again just follows what we had done in encryption. For a long time, encryption was hidden. They would say, well, if I tell you how I do encryption, then you would know how to break it. And then we found hardness proofs for encryption so that we can tell you what the encryption method is. Something encrypted by it, you still can't break it. And that's really where we are already in the the privacy assessment kind of models that Colette or Brad or I talk about. And we have many more types of things. And so it would be really nice to sort of start a bandwagon that moves, and that the statistician provision is exactly the right place for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you, Kim, Latanya, Khaled, and Alessandro for sharing your time with us. We'll have slides up and available.